In the room lit by crystal chandeliers, the evening that seemed like just another elegant reception turned into a stage of humiliation and pain. Emily,
She's so
the young blonde
clumsy.
maid, walked
I can't
silently
believe
among
this
the
is
glasses
happening.
and plates,
I'm so
performing her
sorry.
duties with the same dedication as always. But something different hung in the air. Millionaire Alexander's gaze, previously distant and indifferent, lingered on her in a new, almost forbidden way. The mistress, a haughty and proud woman, immediately realized what was unfolding before everyone. Her husband was not hiding his attention for the maid, and as if the evening demanded a spectacle, the silence was broken by a merciless gesture. Before the astonished guests, the mistress raised a glass of champagne and poured the sparkling liquid over Emily's face. Cruel laughter echoed, and the humiliation spread like poison throughout the room. Emily's eyes burned, not only from the flowing champagne, but from the weight of hundreds of gazes silently judging her. Alexander instinctively stood up, but was caught between shame and hesitation. His mistress, satisfied with her display of power, lifted her chin and smiled, as if she had just crushed a threat. The entire room was divided between those who pretended not to see and those who savored the cruel spectacle. Emily, however, remained steadfast. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't back down. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, feeling that her gesture would not be forgotten, because fate never leaves injustice unpunished. Karma, silent and patient, was already walking through the room, ready to turn the tables in a way no one there would dare imagine. If this story is already moving you, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the outcome of this surprising twist. The dining room of that New York mansion reflected the grandeur of those who believed that wealth could buy everything. Crystal chandeliers cast golden reflections, guests chatted in measured voices, and soft music filled the space as a backdrop to a seemingly perfect evening. For Emily, the waitress, it was just another event where she was expected to move discreetly among the tables, serving bowls and clearing plates as if invisible. But that night, something different burned in her heart. Ever since she started working at that house, she had been silently cultivating a forbidden feeling for the millionaire Alexander. She had never spoken, never given any signs, simply guarded her love like one guarding a dangerous secret. However, his eyes for the first time seemed to recognize in her more than just the girl in uniform. Alexander was the center of attention, wealthy, influential, and admired. All eyes were on him. His wife, elegant and haughty, made a point of asserting her place by his side, flaunting expensive dresses and a practiced smile that hid her insecurities. But that night, in the midst of their conversation, something happened. Alexander's gaze kept straying, as if drawn by an invisible magnet, and this magnet had a name and a face, Emily. She didn't seek it, didn't ask for it, but she felt it. Every time she passed by with the tray in her hands, she noticed his eyes following her. They weren't long glances, but they were enough to set the young woman's heart ablaze. The mistress, however, was not blind. Proud, she understood every detail and refused to share space with anyone, least of all a maid. Her jealousy grew silently, turning into a storm ready to explode. Emily, oblivious to the danger, simply tried to fulfill her duties. She discreetly cleaned the glasses, smiled politely at the guests, and hid within herself a turmoil she dared not reveal. Because, as much as I knew I could never occupy that space, the hope blossoming in my chest was uncontrollable. The evening progressed amid laughter, toasts, and speeches. The millionaire stood to address the guests, and amidst his rehearsed words, his eyes met Emily's. It was a brief moment, but enough for her mistress to see. And in that instant, her decision was born. The poison of pride, mixed with the fear of losing control, led her to prepare an act that would be remembered forever. As everyone applauded Alexander, her mistress took a glass of champagne, walked over to where Emily stood, and without a word poured the sparkling liquid over her face. The hall fell silent. Emily remained motionless, her eyes closed, feeling the cold liquid run down her skin and the weight of hundreds of gazes. Crushing her, some guests gasped in shock, others chuckled quietly, But no one intervened. Alexander took a step forward, but then retreated, unable to immediately face his wife's fury. Emily, however, did not break. She did not fall, did not weep in front of them. She stood, lifting her face, marked by humiliation, and in that silence, she found a strength no one there would understand. It was the strength of someone who had known pain before, of someone who knew that fate, sooner or later, exacts its revenge for every injustice. That night, the hall, illuminated by crystal chandeliers, witnessed not just a public humiliation, but the birth of a turning point that would forever change everyone's lives. Because, contrary to what the boss imagined, the humiliation wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of Karma's silent work. The evening wore on after the scandal, but nothing seemed the same inside the mansion. The guests, in an almost theatrical effort, resumed their conversations, pretending nothing had happened. The piano began to play again, the glasses clinked again, but the air was heavy with a weight impossible to ignore. Alexander remained silent, sitting beside his wife, but his mind wandered. The image of Emily, motionless, her face wet with champagne, had seared itself into his memory like a wound that would not easily heal. He didn't see her simply as the humiliated maid. He saw her as someone who, even in the face of cruelty, had maintained a dignity that his wife, with all her luxury, had never possessed. Emily, for her part, retreated to the kitchen, her heart still pounding like an out-of-step drum. Washing her hands didn't remove the cold sensation on her skin, nor the invisible mark of humiliation. But as she stared at herself in the small, cracked mirror beside the sink, she decided she wouldn't cry. Not tonight, not in front of her boss. The pain was great, but even greater was the strange certainty that her act would not go unpunished. The mistress, haughty in her arrogance, strode through the hall like a victor. Every word she spoke to the guests carried the venom of someone who believed she had regained her throne. But inside, she burned. She realized that, despite the spectacle, something had escaped her control. Alexander was no longer hiding his unease. His gaze, though restrained, sought Emily. Every time she passed the kitchen door, carrying dishes or clearing trays, his eyes followed her with an intensity his wife could not bear. The next day the house seemed too silent. Emily performed her duties with the same discipline, but now there was a new weight in every gesture. The servants whispered about what had happened, some looking at her with pity, others with fear. The mistress, however, would not let the matter drop. In the morning, she called Emily before everyone and ordered her to clean the hall again, even though it was spotless. "I want to see the floor reflecting like a mirror," she said. Sharply. Emily obeyed silently, kneeling before the fury disguised as orders, while the others looked away, unable to intervene. Alexander watched from the stairs. Increasingly, he felt the weight of his mistake in remaining silent. The humiliation Emily had suffered was not only unfair, it was inhumane. Yet he remained paralyzed, torn between the obligation to save face and the growing urge to protect her. This indecision corroded his soul like rust, and with each new cruel gesture from his wife, he approached his breaking point. Emily, however, did not beg, did not bow beyond necessity. Each task performed in silence was, in itself, an act of resistance, and in her heart a certainty grew. Justice did not need to be forced. Fate was watching. That afternoon the mistress gathered friends for tea in the garden. Amidst exaggerated laughter and malicious glances, she made a point of repeatedly calling Emily, asking her to kneel to clean glasses or fetch heavy towels, only to see her bow before the guests. It was a calculated spectacle of humiliation, but cruel as it was, there was one thing the mistress couldn't control: Alexander's eyes. He was present, and his silence was no longer indifference, it was disapproval. Her friends noticed, exchanged uncomfortable glances, and gradually their laughter faded. Emily, even under attack, stood tall and dignified. Then her employer realized something terrible. The more she tried to destroy her maid, the more she exposed her own pettiness. And Alexander in silence began to realize that his heart, despite all conventions, had already made its choice. The following days were like walking on glass. The silence in the mansion was heavy, broken only by the sound of Emily's footsteps in the hallways, and Alexander's suppressed sighs when he thought he was alone. He tried to hide behind appointments, meetings, and phone calls, but every time he passed the young maid, he felt his heart tighten in a way he could no longer ignore. What had previously been a diffuse, almost imperceptible feeling now transformed into something palpable, impossible to contain. One morning, as Emily was arranging flowers in the entrance hall, Alexander slowly descended the stairs. Her gaze was fixed on the arrangement, as if she wanted to lose herself in the petals to escape the memory of the humiliation. But upon noticing his presence, she hesitated for a moment. He approached, stopped a few steps away, and his voice, previously firm and authoritative, sounded almost fragile. "About that night, I should have done something." Emily looked up, surprised. She didn't answer immediately, but the pain on her face spoke for her. He, unable to bear the silence, added, "I saw the injustice, and I won't forget it." The words were short, but for Emily they felt like a confession that struck her deep within. The mistress, however, realized what was happening, even if no one dared tell her. The proud woman's instincts were unwavering. Every time she caught Alexander looking at Emily with an intensity that shouldn't have existed, the venom grew in her heart. It was no longer just jealousy, but a burning desire for destruction. If she couldn't erase that look, she would make a point of crushing the maid in front of everyone. One evening, the mansion welcomed guests again. The drawing room, decorated with white flowers and piano music, seemed a scene of tranquility, but Emily could already sense a storm in the air. Her mistress watched her as if preparing a trap, with a cold, calculated smile. During dinner, she called Emily loudly, demanding that she serve the wine in front of everyone. When the young woman approached, her mistress pretended to drop a glass, the crystal shattering on the floor. "Look what you've done," she shouted, although everyone saw that it was she who had dropped the glass. Emily bent down to pick up the shards, but before she could finish, her mistress pushed another glass, spilling wine over the young woman's uniform. The room fell silent. Alexander stood up, his face red with fury. "Enough," he said firmly. It was the first time he had stood between them in front of everyone. The mistress, surprised, tried to laugh to hide it, but her mask was beginning to crack. Guests exchanged awkward glances, and some even lowered their heads, unable to participate in this cruel scene. Emily, on her knees, picked up the pieces without saying a word, but inside her a flame burned. She was no longer alone. Later, when everyone had left, Alexander looked for Emily in the kitchen. He found her sitting there, her hair down and her uniform stained. He approached, held out a clean handkerchief and said, "I won't let this continue." Emily looked at him hesitantly and simply replied, "It's not me she fears. It's you." Alexander understood her meaning. Her employer not only saw Emily as a threat, but above all, she feared losing control of him. That night, neither of them slept much. Emily, her heart torn between grief and the strange feeling of being protected. Alexander, struggling with a marriage built on appearances and the throbbing truth of a forbidden love. His mistress, meanwhile, lay in her luxurious bedroom, silently plotting her next move. Because for her, humiliation was not enough, it was necessary to destroy. The silence of the mansion before the storm seemed heavier than any scream. The mistress moved through the halls like a restless shadow, her eyes filled with hatred and the forced smile of someone already plotting her next move. Her decision was made. Petty humiliations were no longer enough. Ridiculing Emily in front of visitors was no longer enough. Now she wanted to destroy her dignity in front of everyone, turning her pain into a spectacle. The pretext arose at a charity dinner, one of the most anticipated events among local high society. The mansion was prepared with exaggerated luxury, long tables covered in linen tablecloths, porcelain dishes, gleaming under the light of chandeliers, and dozens of guests parading their expensive clothes like invisible medals. Alexander, though present, seemed absent. His eyes were heavy, as if carrying a struggle he could no longer hide. Emily, impeccably uniformed, moved between the tables trying to disappear, But it was impossible. Her mistress's gaze followed her every step, like that of a predator waiting for the right moment. Halfway through dinner, the mistress stood with her glass, drawing everyone's attention. With rehearsed theatricality, she began to lecture on loyalty, trust, and the danger of people who, disguised as humility, dare to overstep their rightful place. Her words echoed through the room, and many guests, uncomfortable, already knew who she was referring to. Emily remained motionless, her hands trembling as she held a tray. Alexander, noticing, clenched his fists under the table, but didn't interrupt. Not yet. The final blow came when the mistress, smiling coldly, snapped her fingers and ordered, "Emily, come here in front of everyone." The young woman approached, each step carrying the tension of a corridor of no return. The mistress picked up a freshly opened bottle of champagne and, without hesitation, poured the entire liquid over the maid's face and uniform. The room shook with murmurs. Some ladies clapped their hands to their mouths. Men looked at each other, unsure of what to do, but no one dared intervene. Emily, soaked, took a deep breath and kept her eyes raised, refusing to give her mistress the pleasure of seeing her breakdown. It was at that moment that Alexander stood up, his voice cut through the air like thunder. "Enough!" The entire room fell silent. His eyes were no longer filled with doubt, but with fury and determination. He walked over to Emily, took off his own coat, and draped it over her shoulders, shielding her from exposure. Then he turned to his wife, his voice thick with contempt. "Do you think strength is measured by the ability to humiliate others? Today, in front of everyone, you only showed your weakness." The mistress, surprised, momentarily lost the mask she had so long maintained. She tried to laugh, tried to compose herself, but the guests' uncomfortable looks betrayed her. The situation had been reversed. The spectacle he had prepared to destroy Emily had ended up exposing his own cruelty. Emily, even with tears streaming down her face along with the champagne, stood up straight, the tray still firmly in her hands. Something inside her shifted. The pain still throbbed, but now there was the strange feeling that she wasn't alone. Alexander's gaze held her, and the courage that once came only from her silent faith now found an echo in another soul. That night, fate made its first decisive move. Alexander, by choosing to defend her before everyone, crossed a line that could not be undone. And the mistress, in her wounded arrogance, swore to herself that she would not rest until she had turned that gesture into ruin. The war had begun. After the dinner, nothing in the mansion was the same. The silence between Alexander and his wife had become an invisible wall made of resentment and silent accusations. He avoided looking at her, knowing that in her eyes he would only find venom. She, for her part, kept up appearances in society, but inside she burned with hatred. The sight of her husband covering the maid's shoulders with his coat was a ghost that kept her awake. In her mind, that gesture was not just an act of compassion, but a public betrayal, a challenge to her authority, and she swore she would make them both pay. Alexander, however, no longer fought his feelings. With each day, Emily's presence became more vital. He found in her a dignity he had never seen within the luxurious walls where he lived. He looked for reasons to pass her in the hallways, asked trivial questions just to hear her voice, and when he approached, his eyes held a sweetness the young woman couldn't quite handle. Emily, though she feared the consequences, couldn't deny what she felt. The memory of being protected in front of everyone had ignited a flame she could no longer extinguish. One afternoon, when his boss had left for an appointment, Alexander came down to the kitchen. He found Emily washing dishes, her hair tied back simply, her face still lined with fatigue. He hesitated for a moment, but then said quietly, "You know what I saw in you that night? Strength. More than in anyone I know." Emily tried to smile, but her eyes welled up. "Strength didn't protect me from what happened," she replied. Alexander then leaned closer and, almost in a whisper, said, "But it made me see who you really are." The tension of that moment could have been broken with a gesture, but Emily backed away. She knew that giving in would be opening a door that would never close. Meanwhile, the employer was already plotting her revenge. She sought lawyers, spoke with influential friends, and spread discreet rumors about the maid's insolence and the husband's weakness. In her mind, simply firing Emily wasn't enough. She wanted to destroy her irreversibly so that she would never dare look up again. At social gatherings, she dropped insinuations, fueling rumors that the maid was manipulating the millionaire. Each poisonous word fell like a seed on fertile ground, ready to germinate into scandal. In the mansion, the tension was unbearable. Emily could already feel the heavy gazes of the other servants, torn between compassion and fear of being associated with her. She knew something bigger was coming, and she prayed silently for the strength to endure. Alexander, too, sensed the storm brewing, but he wouldn't back down. The more he saw his wife sink into cruelty, the firmer he became in his resolve not to abandon her to her fate. One rainy night, Emily was walking through the garden to collect some forgotten towels when Alexander appeared under the porch. They stood face to face, the rain creating a curtain between them and the rest of the world. He stepped forward, touched her hand, and said, "I can't change the past, but I can choose what I do now." Emily, tears in her eyes, replied simply, "And are you prepared for the price that will come with it?" He said nothing. He just held her gaze. From the upstairs window, the mistress watched. Her heart pounded with rage, and in that instant, she decided she would wait no longer. If Alexander wouldn't abandon Emily willingly, she would take it upon herself to tear the young woman from his life, no matter the cost. Fate was already sharpening its blades. The night chosen by the mistress to exact her revenge arrived shrouded in luxury and appearances, but charged with dark intentions. She had decided to transform yet another business dinner into a stage for Emily's final humiliation. The dining room was perfectly set. Scattered candles, imported wine, expensive dishes. But behind every detail lurked calculated cruelty. Emily was forced to serve the guests in front of everyone, wearing the impeccable uniform her mistress had chosen not out of respect, but out of irony. The mistress's cold gaze followed the young woman's every move, waiting for the right moment to destroy her. When the conversations were at their most lively, the mistress stood up theatrically, drawing everyone's attention. Champagne glass in hand, she repeated the cruel gesture that had marked her first humiliation. She walked over to Emily, looked her up and down, and with a triumphant smile raised her arm to pour the liquid over her face. But this time, fate intervened. Before the glass could tip over, Alexander stood firmly, holding his wife's arm in front of everyone. The silence that followed was absolute. He removed the glass from her hand, set it aside, and declared, "Enough. You will no longer humiliate anyone to sustain your pride. This is the last time your cruelty will echo in this house." The impact was devastating. The stunned guests witnessed the downfall of the woman who had so boasted of power. The lady, in shock, tried to scream, but her voice sounded frail, almost caricatured. What should have been a spectacle of humiliation became a revelation of her own weakness before everyone. Emily, standing, her dignity still intact, watched in silence. He didn't need to defend himself, didn't need to say anything. Fate itself had reversed the roles. In the days that followed, rumors spread quickly through society. It was no longer Emily who was seen as a threat or a disgrace. It was her employer who now bore the mark of exposed cruelty. Friends drifted away, invitations disappeared, and her hard-built reputation crumbled like a sandcastle washed away by the tide. Alexander, finally freed from the prison of appearances, had no more doubts. He owned his choices, left his wife, and found in Emily not only the woman he loved, but the companion who had always demonstrated strength in silence. Emily, though scarred by the pain she experienced, never forgot the night she was transformed into a spectacle of humiliation. But she understood, upon seeing her employer lose everything, that karma had acted. Life had given back to each person what they deserved. The woman who had used her power to destroy was left with only loneliness and society's contempt. Alexander was left with the lesson that true value lies not in gold or applause, but in the courage to recognize him where the truth lies. And she, the young maid who had endured everything with her head held high, was left with what seemed impossible: respect, love, and the place that never needed to be demanded, only revealed. The dinner that began with pain and humiliation ended as a symbol of justice. The mansion, which had once been the scene of cruelty, now held new meaning, because the story wasn't about wealth or power, but about the certainty that nothing escapes the eyes of fate. And in that silent house, lit only by the soft light of candles, Emily realized that the humiliation she had suffered had been just the seed. Karma had blossomed before everyone's eyes. If this story spoke to your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and comment. Fate always takes its toll.